God now, so I'm very grateful. And so would you join me in a moment of prayer today? Gracious and holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I will say to Mary and Danny Brown, Labor Day weekend is lucky for us too. Because Mark and I celebrated our 41st anniversary on Monday. My son got married on Sunday. His sister celebrated her anniversary on Tuesday. It's a good weekend for us, and so we appreciate that. All right. So as we talk about superheroes today, I wanted to look at this story of the Good Samaritan because it is an ordinary person doing extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. And so it is good for us to look at this story in conjunction with our idea of superheroes and how a lot of times we just want somebody else to come in and take care of the problems. We just want to wait for that superhero. So, that's okay. I don't need to step in. Someone else will take care of it. And yet often, as we do what God is calling us to do, we are fulfilling God's calling, and we are fulfilling the example of the greatest superhero of all time, Jesus the Christ. Amen? All right. So I am going to talk a little bit about superheroes today. You don't get to break out the Halloween costumes early every year. And I will tell you, too, that we've been planning this for some time. I had gotten here last July a year ago. And it wasn't long after I was here that Randy Wirtz comes up to me and says, "What color capes would you two like to have?" And so we've had these red capes for some time. We've been ready for this. So here we go. But when you look at superheroes, I'm going to wax poetic here a little bit. But I looked at both DC Comics and Marvel Comics. I looked at men and women, and I even threw in a teenager there. So we're going to look at all these superheroes and maybe kind of glean some things out of that, compare it to the Good Samaritan story, and then also do a recognition and a remembrance for 9/11. So here we go. Just hold on to your hats, folks. Here we go, all right? So what makes someone a superhero? And what would we look for to identify one that's out of uniform, And then what choices do our superheroes have concerning their identities and their special powers? So the number one classic for me always has been and always will be Superman. He's been around for quite some time. You might remember he is known as Clark Kent. And so as Clark Kent, he's just a regular, guy, but Superman came to us from another planet, right? And he lost his parents. He was adopted by an earthly family. He has all these special powers. And so he has to hide them from the rest of the world. He had a hard time as he was growing up trying to fit in because he didn't. Right? On his world, he wouldn't have had these superpowers. He would have been just like everyone else. But here, he had these superpowers. He can fly. He has super strength. He has that special X-ray vision, right? He has limits, absolutely. But he has to hide who he is most of the time. I'm wondering if we've ever felt that way. I'm wondering if we can, relate a little bit to maybe not just fitting in all the time, right? And so there's our Superman, number one. Number two is obviously a favorite. Renee, you and I, we got this, There she is. There she is. So Wonder Woman made her appearance in 1942, and she was scandalous from the very beginning. Can you figure out why? Think about 1942 and how this woman was dressed, right? I chose a much more conservative view on purpose, all right? But not only that, but she was also known as the daughter of the Greek god Zeus, which also made her rather controversial. But she is an Amazon, and so in her world, she is just like everyone else. She has these agility and super strength and all these special abilities, but on Earth, she is something different, right? And so she too has to hide herself. She portrays herself as Diana Prince. She comes to our world to return Steve Trevor to his world, and she decides to stay. But she gave up everything in her world to be here in ours. And so I wonder, sometimes maybe we feel like we're out of place or out of touch, or we don't fit quite in. And so she struggles with that too. Next is the Incredible Hulk. I don't know if y'all remember the Incredible Hulk. We saw somebody was up here dressed as Hulk. I know he was there. So this was Dr. Bruce Banner. He becomes the Hulk by accident. He's exposed to gamma rays, and suddenly when he gets angry, he turns into the Incredible Hulk. It's like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of thing, and he can't control it. I don't know if you all remember the original TV show back in the 70s, but there was a line from that TV show that I loved, and Dr. Banner is saying, "Don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry," right? And because he turns into the Hulk. But since he can't control this, but for some reason the Hulk maintains some of Dr. Banner's principles because he is always righting wrongs and helping those in need with this super strength that he has. But Dr. Bruce Banner wanders the earth looking for a cure so that he can either control this or stop becoming the Hulk. And so he's a loner. Ever felt like a loner? Ever felt like you were the only one in the world that understood what you were going through? And so that is part of the struggle that the Hulk deals with. Captain America, that's our next one. Captain America is Steve Rogers. He was a frail young man, but towards the end of World War II, he volunteers for a special serum injection to make him into a super soldier. The idea was to end World War II. That's why these super soldiers were created. However, through some accident, he is frozen in ice. There's an accident, and he's like plunged into the Arctic Ocean and frozen in ice and suspended in suspended animation for many years. I believe it's 70 years. And so when they thaw him out, he is a man from the 1940s living in the 2000s. And so he's struggling with us. He's a man out of time. He has these great principles of helping others and doing good and using his superpowers that he has. He also has a really cool shield, just saying, But, he fights for those to right wrongs in our world. But he's a man out of time. He doesn't feel like he fits in most of the time. Sound familiar too? Can we relate just a little bit to some of these struggles? Spider-Man. This is the first time that a comic had a teenager as the main character. Usually teenagers were sidekicks. They were never the main one. And Spider-Man made his first appearance in the month and year that I was born, August of 1962. That is when Spider-Man made his first appearance. But he's a teenager, so he's struggling with things that teenagers struggle with. He's also an orphan. He's being raised by his aunt and uncle. They are struggling financially, and he is bitten by a radioactive spider that gives him all these spider-like qualities. Suddenly, he can climb walls, and he has this great agility and super strength, but he also has a spidey sense, that almost ESP-like, where he can tell that things are going to happen before they do. He's also a smart kid because he creates these web shooters so he can swing on these, spider webs all over the place. But it's after his uncle is killed in a robbery that he chooses to be Spider-Man and fight for good and to help right the wrongs in our world. But he's a teenager. He struggles with things like adolescence and first love and all those things that teenagers struggle with. But hey, he's Spider-Man. I think he's a favorite. He's sitting right outside on that landing out there if you want to see him. And I'll give you my one more, and this is Captain Marvel. This is the one you may not know too well. Captain Marvel, a.k.a. Carol Danvers. There have been several versions of Captain Marvel, including male versions of Captain Marvel. But I like this one. She is Carol Danvers. She is an Air Force pilot. And through an accident, she is in the presence of someone from another planet, and through this accident, their DNA is merged. And so she has all these superpowers now that this alien had, but she can't remember her past. She has no recollection of what happened to her in her past. She gets glimpses of things that have happened to her in the past. And so she's lost her past. She doesn't know who she is. I wonder if we felt that way too. And yet, she does fight for good throughout the universe, and just like all of our other superheroes. And so there you have them, the superheroes that we're going to look at today. But I wanted to talk about how a lot of them struggle with things that we struggle with as well. They may have super abilities, superpowers, but we struggle as well. And yet, there are superheroes among us. AKA the Good Samaritan. And so when Jesus talked about the story of the Good Samaritan, there are specific points in this story that he brings out that are extremely important. First of all, he says that the man who fell among the robbers was only half dead. So the Jewish priest and the Levites would have been perfectly able and capable of helping this man. If he were dead, they would not be allowed to touch him because that would make them unclean. But Jesus specifically says he was half dead. So they had every reason that they could help this man, and they chose not to. We have Jews and Samaritans as arch enemies. The Jews had been exiled in Babylon, and yet there were many who had to stay in Jerusalem because they couldn't go with the exiles. They were either too weak, too young, or whatever, and they had to stay in Jerusalem. So while the exiles were in Babylon, others stayed in Jerusalem and made their home here. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem, they considered themselves the true Israelites and had great scorn for those who had stayed. Those who had stayed became known as Samaritans. And so this rift between Jews and Samaritans became so real and so intense that many Jews would bypass Samaria to get from the north to Jerusalem. And they would do it with great distance in order to bypass. They would not have anything to do with one another. And so Jesus presents in this story a good Samaritan. This man who had fallen among the robbers. There are two ways that you would identify someone in this culture, by their clothing and by their accent. Both of those have been removed in this story. He had been stripped of his clothing and he is unconscious, and so there's no way to tell where he's from. Y'all, you can tell when somebody's from the South, can't you? There's a distinct, if I start talking like Rita, I know she's from the South. I know that, right? There's an accent there, And clothing was the other thing. But both of those are taken away in this story. There is a good chance that the man who fell among the robbers is an arch enemy of the Samaritans. He was coming from Jerusalem. And so there's a good chance that he was an enemy of this man who came to his aid. And yet it is a Samaritan who comes to the aid of this man and quite literally saves his life. He binds up his wounds. He puts him on his own animal. He takes him to the inn, takes care of him, and even pays extra money to do what is right. He goes out of his way to be, we even use that term, a good Samaritan to someone in need. Is that not our calling? Is that not our calling? Do we not become heroes in someone's life when we answer a call for a need for someone in our community? Tomorrow marks the anniversary of 9/11. For many, it's still raw. You remember exactly where you were and exactly what you were doing when you got that word. For some here, you weren't even born yet. For others, you have zero memory. You don't remember. You were too young, right? But for others, it's still, for my husband and I, it was all about getting home to our children, and neither one of us could do it. We just wanted to reassure our children that we were going to be okay, but many families couldn't. They couldn't do it because their family members had passed away. But there were heroes that day. There were tremendous heroes. And I wanted to present to you a video known as the Great Boat Lift of 9/11. I had called it the Great Boat Rescue. I think it's called both. This is narrated by Tom Hanks. And I don't think this is a familiar story for most of you. But I wanted to share this with you. There goes my mic again. There it is. All right. So, but please watch this with me. I know it's a little long and I know it's getting late, but I want you to just take this in and realize that this was ordinary people coming to the rescue of so many in need in extraordinary times. And so please join with me in watching the Great Boat Lift of 9/11.
I thought I was watching a movie, Towering Inferno at first. And then I looked real close, and I noticed it was the World Trade Center. I was compelled, because I'm a type of person that can't stand by and watch other people suffer. And to me, they were suffering. They wanted to get off the island. and there was no way for them to get off the island other than the water. And I had noticed when I was watching the television, I saw a lot of, the ferries going up into the slips and taking people off. I said, fine, we could do the same thing. I could take people on my boat, get in there, take them where they have to go. And that's what we did.
On the morning of September 11th, when the towers came down, millions of people ran for safety. Hundreds of thousands of them ran south to the water's edge. That's when they realized that Manhattan is indeed an island, and that they were trapped.
They were feeling helpless, and that's the worst feeling in the world. What was a person on the ground going to do? Buildings were down. There were people laying under the rubble of the building. Firemen, civilians. My wife was there, and I turned around. I says, I've got to go do something. Just like that. And she looked at me. She says, what are you going to do, you maniac? I says, I'm going to take the amberjack up into the city and help. She says, but what if they're attacked again? I says, well, then that's something I have to live with. I says, I have to do what I have to do. I says, and nobody can stop me right now. Even if I save one person or I rescue one person, that's one person less that will suffer and die.
They were trying to evacuate Manhattan because nobody knew what was going on. You didn't know if something else was going to happen. It was just a madness on one side and wanting to help people on the other side.
They were just streaming out of the buildings, and the first mode of transportation they saw was a ferry boat. That's when they knew, this is how I'm getting out of here. So they didn't even care where the boat was going.
There wasn't panic in New York in the beginning, just volume. It wasn't until the first building fell that there was panic.
You heard the building go down, but we're in the slip, so we can't see it. That's when we started letting go, and then all of a sudden, engulfed. You couldn't see anything.
People were actually jumping into the river and swimming out of Manhattan. Boats were very nearly running them over.
Wait. These people wanted out of Manhattan no matter any way they could.
Somebody wants you to go over there.
Every mode of transportation out of Manhattan was shut down. All the subways were shut. The tunnels were all closed. They closed the bridges, they closed everything immediately.
Boats, usually an afterthought in most New Yorkers' minds, were for the first time in over a century the only way in or out of Lower Manhattan.
We're gonna start evacuating people. Anybody can get over here, we're gonna evacuate them.
The process actually had already started. There were some boats that were grabbing people, and people were lining up at the walls.
On the left.
It's just human nature. You see people in distress on the seawall in Manhattan begging you to pick them up. You have to pick them up.
They didn't know what was going on. They seen the building getting hit with these two planes. As far as they was concerned, we were being bombed. I was wondering if they were going to come on the boat, if they had people with bombs, or if they were going to come on. We're a big orange target in the middle of that harbor. My job is to keep the boat safe, my passengers safe, my crew safe.
Everybody was in shock, running around. They didn't want to leave their families. They had loved ones running around the city.
Anybody has a baby? Nobody has it.
There was one guy ran from the apron and jumped onto the boat. He grabbed onto the metal, climbed up right next to the pilot. So I'm going out there to say something. He slides down to the next deck. So the deckhands get him and go, what are you doing? He goes, I'm jumping for my life. So, you couldn't argue with him there.
There was a small boat that was at the lower tip of Manhattan. I thought the boat was going to flip over because so many people were trying to get on. And as I looked behind, they were just 10 deep. And that's kind of what gave us the idea.
We decided that this has to get better organized and we better do it, and that's what we did.
So we decided to make the call on the radio. All available boats. This is the United States Coast Guard aboard the pilot boat, New York. Anyone want to help with the evacuation of Lower Manhattan? Report to Governor's Island.
When that call came on the radio, they were coming.
I was uncertain of who was going to respond. About 15, 20 minutes later, there are just boats all across the horizon.
Literally 100 targets converging on the lower part of Manhattan.
When we came out of that dust cloud, tugboats, I'd never seen so many tugboats all at once.
There was just like a fleet of tugboats headed to Manhattan.
If it floated and it could get there, it got there.
All different size, shapes, and form. I mean, and they were zooming across this water.
Ferries, private boats, party boats.
I worked on the water for 28 years. I've never seen that many boats come together at one time that fast. One radio call and it just came together just that fast.
Hundreds of boats converged on the city, leaving the sun-bathed harbor behind them. Dead ahead, the unknown.
That was something I won't forget. It was just low, dark, acrid, black smoke. It's like there was a big chimney in Manhattan. When we pulled into Pier 11, the dust was unbelievable.
And then out of nowhere, you just kept on seeing people coming.
They looked like zombies coming through the fog, and you knew that those were human beings.
Don't leave us. Please don't leave us here. Take us. At that point, the Coast Guard said, not how many people are you allowed, how many people can you fit?
Come on, guys. Anybody coming? Get your ass over here now. Now. Come on.
Boats started hanging, literally would take a bedsheet off a bunk and a can of spray paint and paint their destination on.
Some of these people never been in the water, never been on a boat before.
Housewives, workers that do windows. We had executives. And the thing that was the best, everyone helped everyone.
I want you to hold my hand. Come on board. Get inside. One at a time. Get inside.
I saw 4 businessmen lifting up an old woman with a seeing eye dog, a German Shepherd, and they lifted her up like a surfboard and passed her over the handrails.
When we would carry a load of people over, and there was somebody standing there that seen their husband or wife, you know, that made us feel even better, you know. Well, at least we got 2 back together, you know. Just keep on going, you know.
The guy that works at the ferry, he's a welder. His son was on my boat. He actually came up. He thanked me.
We went back and forth all day long, carrying boatloads, as many as our boat would hold. And it was a lot of people. A lot of people.
You couldn't have planned nothing to happen that fast, that quick.
No training. This was just people doing what they had to do that day.
You forget all about what you're supposed to do, what they teach you in school, and you say, you know what? Morally, this is the right way to go, and deep down, this is what I'm gonna do.
Average people. They stepped up, and when they needed to, they showed me, you know, when the American people need to come together and pull together, they will do it.
I do feel a way honored that I was a part of it.
That was the greatest thing I ever did with my life.
The greatest day that I've ever seen in all my boating. I mean, my life on the water.
The Great Boat Lift of 9/11 became the largest sea evacuation in history. Larger than the evacuation of Dunkirk in World War II, where 339,000 British and French soldiers were rescued over the course of 9 days. On 9/11, nearly 500,000 civilians were rescued from Manhattan by boat. It took less than 9 hours.
I believe somebody has a little hero in them. You gotta look in, and it's in there. It'll come out if need to be.
I have one theory in life. I never want to say the word I should have. If I do it and I fail, well, I tried. If I do it and I succeed, better for me. And I tell my children the same thing. Never go through life saying you should have. If you want to do something, you do it.
Which of these three do you think was the hero, man who fell among the robbers? The one who showed mercy. Go and do likewise. Our purpose statement: to be disciples who make disciples, who live and love like Jesus. And so today, we are honored to celebrate the greatest superhero of all time, Jesus, the one who gave his all for us and saved the world. I love the cover of your bulletin where Jesus is sitting around amongst those superheroes saying, and that's how I saved the world. And the scripture reference is John 3:16 and 17. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believed in him should not perish but have eternal life. So as we segue right into our service